Before we get back to David Foster Wallace, I think we should take a historical detour. Back in the late 1980s, when I was a working journalist just out of college, I used to split the rent on a 3-story redwood house by the beach in Cambria, California, with a friend of mine named Christopher Moore. At the time, Chris was a waiter with grandiose literary ambitions. He swore to me that the 90s would be the Chris Moore decade, even though there seemed zero chance of anything like that happening. When we weren't acting out as raging alcoholics or lurching after women, Chris and I spent our free time working on novels. His first, my third. But aside from my rabble-rousing newspaper articles, neither of us had published anything worth mentioning. The prospect of authorial fame was remote. My girlfriend around that time was a slumming Hollywood socialite. Let's call her Justine the Screaming Eelskin Queen, since that's the name she goes by in my latest book. Justine was the sort of person who went around wearing a red square-dance petticoat over Wicked Witch of the West leggings while smoking White House cigars and eating her daily ration of lithium from a jaunty Woody the Woodpecker Pez dispenser. In other words, loads of fun, but at times dangerously crazy. She once broke a lamp over my head because I wanted to read in bed on a Saturday night. Justine's best friend JJ was friendly with a literary agent at a scrappy little boutique agency in Beverly Hills or Studio City or someplace like that. And when Chris finished writing his novel, which he'd titled Practical Demon Keeping, JJ gave the manuscript to her agent friend on Justine's recommendation. Here's where things got weird. The agent passed around that unpublished first manuscript by an unknown writer and somehow started a bidding war for it among several major movie studios. It ended up selling to Disney for $400,000. Holy shit, right? $400,000 bought a lot more back in 1990 than it does now. Little Brown and Company's advance for Infinite Jest in June of 1992 was just $80,000 for the sake of comparison, and David Foster Wallace was already an established writer with 2 successful books behind him at that point. Chris's score was big news in our little coastal community. I contacted a friend of mine at a regional arts and entertainment weekly called New Times that I wrote for occasionally, a guy named Todd, and I told him the story. Todd ended up writing a feature article on Chris the Waiter's remarkable Cinderella-like debut among the cultural elite of Hollywood. He also took a picture of Chris on a shitty Soviet-made plastic-lensed camera and put it on New Times' front cover. Chris, with his usual narcissistic flair, immediately went out and purchased a shiny new gold Nissan 300ZX on a no-money-down plan, using the New Times article as his only credit reference. I still can't get over that. Unfortunately, Disney took a long time to get the promised checks, so Chris had to borrow the money from his widowed mom to make the first few car payments. He took me for a late-night drive in the ZX shortly after his return from a meeting to sign contracts with this agent down in Los Angeles, where he'd been introduced to the big-time movie producer, Don Simpson. Note 8. Simpson was the coke-snorting, prostitute-patronizing half of the insanely successful production team Simpson-Bruckheimer, responsible for such style-over-substance blockbusters as Flashdance, Beverly Hills Cop, and Top Gun.
Tom Cruise.
By 1996, Simpson was dead at 52 from heart failure and general fucked-out party junkie exhaustion after carving a druggy, erotic swath through Hollywood so lurid and legendary that it would be rivaled only by an elite few, like Fatty Arbuckle and Charlie Sheen.
The run I was on made Sinatra, Flynn, Jagger, Richards, all of them just look like, droopy-eyed, armless children.
Return to main text. Chris was in a manic mood, and we hurtled along the curvy Pacific Coast Highway at over 130 miles an hour. If an overfed raccoon had flashed its bandit mask in our headlights, it could have spelled the end for both of us, but the local wildlife had the good sense to stay in the shadows that night, which is where I ended up staying too. I was happy for my friend. In fact, I felt a kind of pride to be so closely associated with a writer who had made it. That pride only grew as Chris went on to write many more successful novels. Bloodsucking Fiends, Lamb, A Dirty Job, You Suck, Fool, Sacre Bleu, etc., some of which actually made it onto the New York Times bestsellers list. But at the same time, a spiteful imp inside me was always asking, why is that fucking clown catching all the breaks? After a few failed screenplay adaptations, including one written on spec by yours truly that, according to Chris, was rumored to be going into production until it was nixed by the famously fickle Jeffrey Katzenberg, Disney decided not to make a movie from Practical Demon Keeping after all. So the $400,000 ended up as a sort of gift, allowing Chris the financial freedom to ease into his career as a novelist without having to work at some soul-sucking day job like the rest of us. Over the years, Chris's luck held. He bought a house on the island of Kauai and lived there for a few years. Then he bought a lavish home in San Francisco that had been designed by the famous architect of Hearst Castle, Julia Morgan. He became a multimillionaire, a world traveler. He had the luxury of being able to do pretty much whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted to do it, all just from writing books. Note 9. Most writers aren't so fortunate. In fact, the majority don't earn enough from writing to make the payments on a used Kia, much less a spiffy new sports car and an upscale home in San Francisco. At the time this essay was coming together, I had 6 books of my own in print under various pseudonyms, namely Derek Swannson, Crash Gordon, Darren Westland. But I've never been in any danger of becoming rich or famous. Unlike Chris, I tend to shy away from vulgar bids for attention, like requiring my publishers to place full-page ads for my latest novels in the New York Times Book Review, or arrange for my books to be stacked on the new fiction tables at every Barnes & Noble on the entire goddamn planet. If our careers as authors could be metaphorically compared as music industry acts, Chris would be like some telepod-fused Cronenbergian combo of Alice Cooper and Jimmy Buffett, playing stadiums, while I would be an unknown autistic protest singer backed by a cloned mariachi band in birdshit-stained sombreros, busking on the less-traveled streets of Seattle and Newark. I'd be lying if I said our socioeconomic disparity hasn't grated on me at times. You want your friends to be successful, but not too successful, if you know what I mean. When you're faced with serious money constraints and your old friends aren't, it pisses you off in a vague sort of way. Their Facebook posts and Twitter feeds remind you that they're free to express their agency in the world, while you're walking around in the financial equivalent of a straitjacket, buffeted by a never-ending internal math equation. Our hours worked times hourly wage minus percentage of taxes withheld greater than or less than the usual monthly bills plus surprise expenses plus Visa, American Express, MasterCard, debits, credits, etc. Along with wince-inducing waves of guilt if you should even so much as contemplate buying a $12 sandwich from Dean and DeLuca on your lunch break instead of settling for the usual lukewarm boiled hot dog and a peach tea Snapple from the vendor under the blue and yellow soubrette umbrella across the street as Beck sings his sad hipster earworm refrain inside your skull. Soy un perdedor. I'm a loser, baby, so why don't you kill me? Here's a footnote to the footnote. In light of my 1990 journalistic clash with the Hearst Corporation, it's interesting to note that Chris's publishers, Avon, William Morrow, and HarperCollins, all happened to be Hearst Corporation imprints for most of the Chris Moore decade, until those same imprints were swallowed whole in an acquisition by Rupert Murdoch's News Corp in 1999. Return to main text. When Chris and I were hanging out together in the 80s, drinking cheap beer on the back patio with the Velvet Underground cranked up on the stereo too loud, he used to tell me stories about growing up in Ohio. Chris's dad had been a highway patrolman with a warped sense of humor. He'd sit down with the family for dinner after a hard day on the job and tell funny stories about the horror of life. In the grim tradition of dead baby jokes, a slain 4-year-old by the side of the road became comic fodder. It was a coping strategy, a way to keep from going insane, as Chris explained it. He internalized that coping strategy, and after his dad died from a heart attack in his early 50s, like Don Simpson, Chris became the world's best-selling horror humorist. I've often wondered what it was exactly that made Chris's first book so beguiling that Disney was willing to fork over $400,000 for it. Todd the journalist described practical demon keeping as, quote, a popcorn read, unquote, in the article that he wrote about Chris for New Times. So we're not talking about a Dostoevskian examination of the human soul here. What was it then? The plot? The humor? I'm working on an answer to that, but right now, if the mousy woman in the yellow Patagonia fleece jacket raised her hand and asked Chris where he got his ideas, I could tell her this. When Chris was a sullen 16-year-old growing up in Mansfield, Ohio, he had a habit of driving around in his beat-up old Chevy late at night with his jaw clenched, feeling misunderstood and melancholy. For the most part, this was due to an abject failure to get laid, as I interpreted it. The cops in Mansfield thought Chris looked suspicious, going around with his jaw clenched like that. So they pulled him over, despite his dad being a highway patrolman, and they searched his car for drugs. This happened on more than one occasion. In fact, it happened all the time. The cops never found anything, but they persisted. Chris became so resentful of this routine that he started to fantasize about driving around with an invisible, man-eating monster in his backseat, lurking under the pile of discarded Taco Bell burrito wrappers, suck-dry Wendy's milkshake cups, and a talismanic scattering of Trojan condoms still in their hopeful blue foil packages. The next time the cops pulled him over, Chris would say, "You might not want to search the backseat this time, because there's a monster in there." If the cops didn't heed his warning, they would get even. That's basically the plot of Practical Demon Keeping. A guy drives around in an old Chevy with an invisible monster in the backseat, and people get even. Some of you might be having the same reaction that many people describe when viewing some of the less skillful manifestations of modern art. My kid could do that. And indeed, as David Foster Wallace would later say of his own first book, The Brim of the System, a very smart 14-year-old could have written it. Maybe that's what Disney liked about Practical Demon Keeping, its potential appeal to the misunderstood, jaw-clenched teen demographic. But I think there was more to it than that. Here's a clue. Another writer friend of mine, Jason Horsley, recently published a scholarly